A single bark, desperate and sharp, echoed through the night, a harbinger of danger that would make your heart race. What followed would change a life forever, and you won't believe who the unlikely hero of this story of survival and redemption was. If you love heartwarming tales of animal loyalty, don't forget to like this video, share your own experience with a four-legged friend in the comments, and of course, subscribe to the channel for more moving narratives that prove true love can emerge in the most unexpected ways. Could it be that the echo of a lifetime of choices, of fears and losses, could be encapsulated in the damp, persistent sound of April rain falling on Maplewood Lane? For Isabella Adams, the answer seemed to be a resounding yes. At 38, she was the personification of success forged in fire, a real estate executive whose ambition was as sharp as the heels of her designer shoes. Her pragmatism was a polished armor, her elegance a fortress. On that gray afternoon, as the leaden sky unleashed fine drops that turned the streets into dark mirrors, she turned up the volume of the classical music in her imported sedan, a vain attempt to drown out the outside world and perhaps the world within. It was then that her eyes, for the briefest instant, caught the image. Huddled under the awning of a closed store, a lean mutt with dirty caramel-colored fur was trembling. It wasn't pity that crossed Isabella's face, but a spasm of pure irritation. Disorder. That's what the dog represented. The personification of the unforeseen, of the misery she had fought so hard to leave behind, a ghost of the bankruptcy and premature death of her parents, a trauma that had sculpted her, instilling in her a paralyzing fear of vulnerability and an almost unhealthy obsession with control. That dog was an unwanted reminder that chaos existed, lurking, ready to swallow the order she had built with such effort. That first encounter, marked by Isabella's calculated indifference, would be the prologue to a transformation neither could have foreseen. In the days that followed that chance encounter in the harsh rain, Isabella began to notice, with growing annoyance, that the stray seemed to have chosen the vicinity of her upscale condo complex as its new territory. It was a silent but persistent presence. She saw him near the impressive gatehouse, watching the coming and going of expensive cars, and hurried residents with a cautious intelligence in his amber eyes that seemed to carry the melancholic wisdom of the streets. Deliberately, Isabella looked away, quickening her pace, her rigid posture a clear sign of revulsion. She pretended not to see the creature that, to her, was just another blur in the urban landscape that should be impeccable. However, in the back of her mind, where childhood memories stubbornly survived, a spark of something indecipherable, perhaps the faint memory of a dog she had owned before the family's ruin, a loyal companion from a simpler, happier time, disturbed her. It was an uncomfortable feeling, like a discordant note in her symphony of control and order. Isabella's life, however, followed its relentless course, each day a calculated battle. An important expansion project for her development company, an undertaking that was supposed to be the crowning achievement of her career, faced unexpected bureaucratic obstacles, draining her energy and patience, making her even more reclusive and obsessively focused on work. Stress was a tight knot in her stomach, a constant tension in her shoulders, and the dog, whom the security staff of the complex, with a familiarity Isabella found inappropriate, had nicknamed Caramel, remained. He was a constant in her peripheral vision, a silent reminder of the disorder she so loathed. One particularly cold morning, when the sun was still struggling to break through the fog that hung over the city, Isabella went out for her morning run, a sacred routine that helped keep her mind sharp and her body in shape. As she rounded the corner of her building, she almost stumbled over something soft and warm. It was Caramel, curled up near a flowering bush, seeking some remnant of warmth. The scare made her lose her balance for a moment, and for a second their eyes met. In those amber globes she saw no threat, only a deep weariness and a resignation that somehow affected her. It was a fleeting moment, but the unwanted physical proximity and the dog's gaze left her strangely shaken. She quickly composed herself, the mask of coldness returning to place, and continued her run. But the rhythm of her thoughts had been disturbed. Later that day, Mr. Arthur, a kind elderly neighbor who lived downstairs, a man of simple habits and an easy smile, was seen by Isabella leaving a small bowl with leftovers near the same bush. He spoke to the dog in a low voice, an affectionate tone that contrasted brutally with Isabella's icy indifference. She watched the scene from her apartment window, a mix of disdain and a twinge of something she couldn't name. Sentimental fools, she thought, but the image of Mr. Arthur and Caramel persisted in her mind. Weeks turned into a month, then almost 2. The expansion project continued to consume Isabella. Tense meetings, tight deadlines, the constant threat of failure hanging like a dark cloud. She became increasingly irritable, more withdrawn into her own world of spreadsheets and financial projections. Caramel, meanwhile, seemed to have developed his own routine. He no longer confined himself to the vicinity of the gatehouse. He began to follow Isabella at a respectful distance when she went out for her morning runs or walked to the upscale bakery on the corner. She noticed his presence, a caramel-colored shape moving in the shadows, in the cracks of the urban landscape. Initially, she tried to ignore him. Then she tried to scare him away with a stern look, but he would just stop, wait for her to move a little further away, and then resume his silent vigil. It was as if the wet asphalt of the city, once a broken mirror reflecting a melancholic sky, now also reflected the persistent shadow of that dog, a silent observer of her increasingly troubled life. Caramel's eyes, when she allowed herself to look at them, seemed like windows to a soul hungry not just for food, but for an affection that Isabella refused to grant, either to herself or to any other being. Her loneliness was a self-imposed cocoon, and the presence of that dog was a subtle threat to that enclosure. One night, returning very late from a particularly exhausting meeting that had stretched into the early hours, Isabella's car broke down on a poorly lit street a few blocks from her condo complex. The silence of the night was broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine and the distant sound of a siren. Frustrated, and with her nerves frayed, she took out her cell phone to call for a tow truck when she noticed 2 suspicious figures emerging from the shadows of a nearby alley, walking towards her with a menacing slowness. A shiver ran down her spine. Her heart pounded. It was then that a furious, hoarse, and unexpected bark tore through the air. Caramel, appearing out of nowhere like a spectral protector, positioned himself between Isabella and the men, growling and lunging with surprising courage for his size and apparent fragility. The men hesitated, clearly intimidated by the dog's ferocity, and after a few seconds of tension, they turned around and disappeared back into the darkness. Isabella stood frozen, cell phone still in hand, the echo of Caramel's barks reverberating in her ears. The dog, panting, looked at her for an instant, then backed away a few steps as if expecting a reprimand. She said nothing, still processing what had just happened. She attributed the intervention to a coincidence, to the animal's territorial instinct, but a seed of doubt had been planted. That miserable stray whom she had so despised had protected her. The thought was unsettling. In the days that followed the incident on the dark street, Isabella found herself, against her will, looking for Caramel. She wouldn't admit it aloud, not even to herself, but his absence from her usual routes created a small void, a strange quietness. One afternoon, leaving work, she bought an expensive sandwich from her favorite deli. She ate only half and, approaching her building, saw Caramel lying near a flower bed, looking thinner and more dejected than usual. On an impulse she didn't understand herself, she accidentally dropped the remaining half of the sandwich near the flower bed before hurrying into the building. From her apartment window, she watched, hidden behind the curtain, as Caramel cautiously approached the wrapper, sniffed it, and finally devoured it ravenously. A small crack had formed in her armor of indifference. The cost of this small concession was an uncomfortable feeling of vulnerability, as if she had betrayed her own principles of detachment. Isabella's fear, that old and persistent shadow that, lengthened with the setting sun of her hopes, seemed to flicker before that small act of unintentional compassion. Meanwhile, her development company's expansion project hit a critical hurdle. A key investor, spooked by malicious rumors about the company's financial instability. Rumors Isabella suspected had been planted by an unscrupulous rival named Richard Miller, a man known for his dirty tricks in the market, threatened to withdraw his capital. The news hit like a bomb. Isabella felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. The control she had fought so hard for was slipping through her fingers. She spent sleepless nights poring over numbers, seeking solutions, anxiety gnawing at her from within. On one of these mornings, after a particularly hellish night, she saw Caramel coughing and trembling from the cold near the service entrance of the complex. He looked sick. His fur bristled, his eyes feverish. For a moment, the image of her parents, weakened by illness and financial despair, assaulted her mind. Shaking her head to push away the painful memory, Isabella got into her car. But on the way to the office, something made her stop at a cheap department store. She bought a small, simple blanket. Later, returning home, she discreetly left the blanket near the spot where Caramel usually took shelter. She didn't look back. That gesture, small and anonymous, represented another fissure in her emotional shell, and the cost was a growing sense that she was losing control not only of her business, but of her own rigidly contained emotions. Caramel's bark, once an annoying sound she tried to drown out with classical music, began to acquire a new meaning. It was almost like an alarm of loyalty sounding in the silence of the indifference she had cultivated for so long. A few days later, Caramel, already recovered from his ailment, thanks in part to the blanket that had protected him from the damp night air, did something that surprised Isabella deeply. As she walked towards her car in the building's parking garage, he trotted towards her, wagging his tail timidly, and dropped an old, slightly chewed tennis ball at her feet. He looked at her expectantly, his amber eyes shining. Isabella froze. A gift? From that mutt? She almost smiled, a strange, forgotten movement on her lips. Quickly, however, she recomposed her serious facade. She picked up the ball, feeling its familiar texture, and without saying a word, got into the car. She put the ball in the glove compartment, a secret she shared with no one. That simple object, a symbol of an offer of canine friendship, became a small hidden treasure, proof that something was changing within her, even if she refused to admit it. That was a turning point, a moment when indifference began to give way to a cautious curiosity, almost a reluctant affection. The tension in her professional life, however, offered no respite. Richard Miller intensified his smear campaign, and Isabella felt increasingly isolated. In a rare moment of fragility, she called her Aunt Helen, her mother's younger sister, with whom she maintained a distant and formal relationship. The conversation was difficult, full of awkward silences, but Aunt Helen, with her quiet wisdom, mentioned Isabella's parents, recalling how they loved the old family dog, a German shepherd named Max, who had been a source of joy and comfort during the difficult times that preceded the bankruptcy. "Your parents had huge hearts, Isabella," Helen said. "They knew the value of loyalty, of selfless friendship. Max was living proof of that." Her aunt's words resonated deeply with Isabella, bringing up bittersweet memories of a childhood she had tried to bury under layers of success and pragmatism. The figure of Caramel, with his inexplicable loyalty, began to intertwine with these memories, creating a complex knot of emotions in her chest. The atmosphere on Maplewood Lane and the surrounding area began to feel heavier. A series of petty thefts from cars and ground-floor apartments had been reported in recent weeks. Nothing too serious, but enough to put residents on alert and increase vigilance. Doormen received stricter instructions. Security cameras were checked more frequently. Isabella, absorbed in her own problems, barely registered the increased tension in the neighborhood, until one night, everything changed. She was returning from another disastrous meeting, where the threat of losing the project had become almost a certainty. It was almost 11 at night. The underground parking garage of the complex was practically deserted, and poorly lit in some areas, creating long and unsettling shadows. The echo of her heels on the polished concrete seemed to amplify the feeling of isolation. As she walked towards the elevator, a figure emerged quickly from behind a pillar. A tall man, hooded, moving with predatory agility. Before Isabella could react or scream, He grabbed her from behind, a rough hand covering her mouth, the other brandishing something metallic that glinted in the dim light. A knife. Panic enveloped her like a cold shroud. The tension in the parking garage was palpable, a high-voltage wire about to snap. Her heart beat like a trapped bird against her ribs. The acrid smell of sweat and fear emanated from the attacker. This was the moment her meticulously constructed control shattered. In that instant of pure terror, when the air left her and the cold blade dangerously grazed her neck, a guttural, fierce growl echoed through the silent parking garage. Caramel, who had somehow managed to get into the garage by following Isabella's car unnoticed, emerged from the shadows like a caramel streak. With a fury that belied his size and generally docile appearance, he launched himself at the attacker, biting his leg hard. The man cried out in pain and surprise, loosening his grip on Isabella enough for her to break free and scream for help. The attacker, now focused on the dog that refused to let go of his leg, tried to kick him, but Caramel dodged and bit the arm holding the knife, making it fall with a metallic clatter onto the floor. The fight was brief but brutal. The man, realizing that his attempt at mugging or something worse had been thwarted, and fearing the arrival of security or residents alerted by Isabella's screams and the dog's furious barking, violently shoved Caramel against a concrete wall and limped away, disappearing up the parking garage exit ramp. The sound of Caramel's body hitting the concrete was a dull, horrible thud. He let out a sharp whimper of pain and lay still on the ground. Isabella, still trembling, her heart pounding, ran to him. She forgot about her expensive suit, her impeccable posture, her reputation for coldness. She knelt on the dirty garage floor, the smell of dust and oil mixing with the metallic odor of the blood that was beginning to stain Caramel's fur. Caramel. Oh my God, Caramel. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, choked with emotion. With trembling hands, she touched the dog, who whimpered softly but tried to lift his head, his amber eyes fixed on hers, full of pain, but also of unwavering loyalty. In that moment, Isabella Adams's armor didn't just crack, it completely disintegrated. The tears, which she had held back for so many years, finally came, hot and liberating, streaming down her face as she carefully picked up Caramel's injured body in her arms. His blood stained her clothes, but she didn't care. The only thing that mattered was saving that being who, without asking for anything in return, had risked his own life for her. The doorman and a security guard, alerted by the screams, arrived running, finding the shocking scene. The elegant and reserved executive, now disheveled and covered in blood, cradling a wounded mutt as if it were the most precious treasure in the world. "I need a vet now," she ordered, her voice firm despite the tears and urgency that brooked no refusal. The rush to the 24-hour vet clinic was a blur of distant sirens in Isabella's memory, the warm, trembling weight of Caramel in her lap, his low whimpers with every jolt of the security guard's car that carried them. In the clinic waiting room, while Caramel was being examined by the veterinarians, Isabella sat, her hands still stained with dried blood, the smell of antiseptic and fear hanging in the air. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she hadn't experienced since her parents' death. The silence of the waiting room was oppressive, broken only by the ticking of a clock on the wall and her own stifled sobs. On an impulse, she picked up her cell phone and dialed her Aunt Helen's number. When her aunt answered, a sleepy voice on the other end of the line, Isabella broke down. She told her everything, between tears and broken words. The attack, Caramel's courage, the paralyzing fear of losing him. Aunt Helen listened patiently, her voice calm and comforting from the other side, offering words of support, and, for the first time in years, Isabella felt she wasn't completely alone. That conversation, in the middle of the night, in a cold and impersonal vet clinic, was the beginning of a reconciliation, a bridge being rebuilt over the turbulent waters of the past. Faith, a word Isabella had banished from her vocabulary, began to flicker timidly in her heart, a small flame of hope that Caramel would be okay. After what felt like an eternity, the veterinarian appeared. His face was serious, but there was a glint of optimism in his eyes. "He's a fighter," the doctor said. He suffered some deep wounds and a few cracked ribs from the impact, but with proper care, he'll recover. He'll need rest, medication, and lots of affection. Isabella felt an immense relief flood her, so strong her legs weakened. "Can he come home with me?" she asked, her voice still choked. The veterinarian smiled. "Of course. In fact, I think that's exactly what he needs." In that moment, there was no hesitation, no doubt. The decision was already made, etched in her heart by the bravery and loyalty of that dog. Caramel was no longer just any stray, an annoyance in her perfectly ordered life. He was her hero, her savior, and he was coming home. Isabella's apartment, once a minimalist sanctuary of coldness and control, began to transform. A soft dog bed was placed in a corner of the living room. Food and water bowls appeared in the kitchen. The silence previously filled only by classical music, or the typing of her computer, was now broken by the soft sound of Caramel's breathing, his hesitant steps as he recovered, and eventually the joyful wagging of his tail. As Caramel recovered, under her attentive care, Isabella, with a new determination, began to investigate the attack. The police, based on her testimony and the security camera footage from the parking garage, which, although it didn't capture the attacker's face, showed his build and the way he limped as he fled, a direct consequence of Caramel's bite, began to build a profile. One of the cameras, positioned near the exit, partially captured the license plate of a suspicious car that left the scene hurriedly moments after the attack. The investigation, driven by Isabella's tenacity and the crucial evidence of the bite, led to a shocking discovery. The attacker was a henchman known for doing the dirty work of unscrupulous businessmen, and the name that emerged as the mastermind was Richard Miller. The attempt at intimidation or something worse had been an escalation of his tactics to get her out of the way on the expansion project. Caramel's courage had not only saved Isabella's life, but it also provided the key to unmasking her rival. With the evidence in hand and a new inner strength she didn't know she possessed, Isabella confronted Richard Miller, not with the calculated coldness of before, but with the calm assertiveness of someone who knows her worth and the value of justice. The accusations, supported by the police investigation, were devastating to Miller's reputation. The expansion project, which seemed lost, was renegotiated. Isabella managed to save the venture, but on new terms, more ethical, more humane. She realized with surprising clarity that success didn't have to be built on the ruin of others, nor on the suppression of her own feelings. The light that Caramel had brought into her life didn't just illuminate her apartment, but also her professional path. Hope, once an empty word, was now a driving force. The months that followed were months of healing and transformation. Caramel recovered completely, becoming Isabella's loyal and cheerful shadow. The apartment, once a reflection of its owner's armor, became a home with colorful cushions, dog toys scattered around, and the warmth of mutual companionship. Isabella, the ruthless executive, began to smile more, to connect with people in a genuine way. She reconnected with her Aunt Helen, and together they visited her parents' grave, bringing flowers and memories of a love that transcended time and pain. Isabella even began volunteering at a local animal shelter on weekends, finding purpose in helping other creatures who, like Caramel, just needed a second chance, a little faith, and a ray of light in their lives. Maplewood Lane, once the scene of her indifference and loneliness, now witnessed her morning walks with Caramel, the morning sun reflecting in the dog's shiny coat and in his owner's rediscovered smile. The echo of that first desperate bark had transformed into the melody of a new life, a symphony of loyalty, rescue, and, above all, love. Caramel's gratitude was a warm sun on a winter morning, melting the last glaciers of Isabella's heart, and hope, once a dormant seed, now bloomed as vibrantly as the jacaranda trees themselves after a long and transformative storm. She finally understood that true strength resided not in absolute control, but in the courage to be vulnerable, to love and be loved, even if by a caramel-colored mutt who had taught her the true meaning of life.